I did change companies. I really haven't changed what I'm doing here. Went to work for Joe and Karen Kerns at Kerns and Associates in Ames. We got all kinds of Kerns people here, so glad to have all of you here with us today. And we're going to talk about what's going on in the markets. It's interesting times, for sure. And one of the things I've characterized, I've been to several state meetings, and Joe asked me, he said, well, what was the mood? And I said, well, it seemed to me that everybody's walking around pinching themselves, trying to just check and make sure this is reality. And it has been good. It's been good this last year. We think it's going to stay pretty good the coming year. One of the things with Kerns Associates, we are affiliated with FC Stone, and so they make me put up this legal stuff, and I'm sure you're done reading that, so we'll go on. Macro conditions continue to be good, and I put for some reason. I mean, one of the real mysteries of the last 10, 12 months has been, why is the stock market doing what it's doing? It's certainly been a move of some confidence, some comfort with federal regulations. Deregulation has helped. There's a lot of things that have fed into this, but we've certainly got good macro conditions. GDP grew by 2.3% year over year in the third quarter. We don't have a fourth quarter number yet. The president wants 3% growth, and I think he's probably going to get it for sure in the fourth quarter. Well, I wouldn't be surprised to see a 4% number on year-over-year growth of GDP in the fourth quarter. And the reason is that hurricanes are really bad when they hit your house, but they're great for the economy when you start cleaning up after them. Okay, they really can put a shot in the arm on GDP from building materials and building services and those kinds of things. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see that. Real personal disposable income, an important measure of income because it is deflated, real, that's what the term real means. Personal disposable income is after taxes, and we put it on a per capita basis. It was just growing at about 1/3 of 1% for the first 9 months of the year. October looked pretty good at plus 0.94, and then November a 1.25%. That's the first time in about 2 years that we've had a year-over-year growth rate of 1% or more on real personal disposable income. We think that's pretty important. It's reflective of what's going on, we think, in the labor market, where we've continued to have growth in employment. We added another 200,000 jobs in November. December was off a little bit at 147,000, but it's going to be the 7th year in a row that we've added 2 million jobs to the job rolls in the United States. Important one is we got the unemployment rate down to 4.1%. Some of you who are trying to hire help right now realize that this is a real challenge. There's a natural rate of unemployment in the economy. It's somewhere in that low 4 range. I think we're probably at it. If we get below that for any extended period of time, we start firing off a lot of inflationary pressure, and then you're going to have to see the Federal Reserve really take some action. Now, a question I get a lot is, what are interest rates going to do? Well, and 2 years ago, it was pretty easy to answer that question because anything that close to zero can pretty much only go one way, unless, of course, you live in the European Union where they're paying the government to hold their money with negative interest rates. That's not going to be the case here, and interest rates have risen, and we think interest rates are going to rise again. The consensus out there is probably two increases this year by the Federal Reserve. I've heard a lot of people the last month or so talking about possibly 3 interest rate increases of 1/4 of a point this year. That still doesn't give us high interest rates by any stretch, and it's mainly a move by the Federal Reserve to get some leverage over the economy should they need it. I mean, if the discount rate is close to zero and something goes haywire in the economy, the Federal Reserve doesn't have any bullets to fire at the thing, and they've been trying to get some ammunition back in their stimulus gun, to speak, as we've gone through the last couple of years, any kind of strength in the economy that raise interest rates a bit, as long as we could stand it. Now, there's a number of other things going on, but we can't discount what I call the wealth effect. I tell the story, my dad spent 30 years working as a postal carrier, blue-collar worker, and provided for us that way. And he never would have ever had any perspective that he had anything at stake in the stock market. Okay? Because he was on a pension, he didn't have an investment, any kind of investment portfolio. He wasn't into that at all. And so, but think about the difference now compared to that kind of view in the 60s and 70s of our population's view of equity markets and the stock market. I mean, we got 401ks, we got IRAs, we got a lot. Most of us have some money at stake in what's going on over there, and we pay attention to it. And when it's good, we feel better about the world, okay? And we actually do have more wealth. And I think that's an important thing about what's going on with the voters and with consumers as well. We have a couple of measures of consumer attitudes that we watch, and through December, they're the highest they've been since 2000, since the year 2000. 17 years, we have the highest levels of positive consumer attitudes out there that we've had in that long of a time period. And that translates into consumers who are willing to spend money, especially if they have some money, which I think the real personal disposable income figure that I cited a while ago says they indeed do. So we're pretty optimistic about consumer demand this year going forward. Now, we look on the supply side, per capita availability, which is also slash disappearance slash consumption. We have, we produce product in the United States, and we eat what we don't export. And whatever's available is going to go somewhere, and it disappears. And we assume that somebody eats it. Now, that may be somebody's dog that eats it, but it disappeared. We don't really care. But that number is creeping back up toward 220 pounds for the 4 major species. And some of you have been here for the last several years, and every one of you heard me tell you that we'll never get back to that record we were at 2006. And I've learned an important lesson about never saying never, okay? Because we're going to get back there. We're at 218 and change this year. We think that it's very likely we'll be back to 220 plus in 2019 because as far as we can see, pork production is going to go up, beef production is going to go up, chicken production is going to grow, turkey production is going to grow as well. And we don't think that we'll probably increase exports enough to reduce that number. So we're at 218 or so this year. I think the proof here is that if we bring American consumers meat protein at a reasonable price, they will eat it. My we'll never get back there was based on a lot of things that were going on. Meatless Mondays, changes in demographics, all of the stuff we hear about antibiotics and animal welfare and all those things that we hear a lot of was putting us down here in this lower area. But, this was mainly a response to higher costs. But I didn't think the weight of that stuff would go away enough that we could push per capita consumption up like we have. It's good that we have. I think it's a real opportunity for us. But the point is that it has gone back and it's a positive. Now, if you take quantity times real price, that's the other dimension of demand is what the price is. And in this case, retail pork prices used to run on a nominal basis between $3 and $3.50 most of the time that's about 8 years. Since then, the last 4 years, we've been between $3.50 and $4.30 almost all the time. We haven't reduced prices. In the fall of 2016, there were a number of producers that would tell me, well, we need to get these retail prices down, keep this product moving. And I said, well, we're moving all the product we're slaughtering. We're not having it build up much in cold storage, not out of reason. So why should we reduce retail prices? And this is something that many of you have heard me harp on before. The goal of about any business is to try to get the price of the product it sells higher. Okay? We want to sell it for more money. And we can't get $1 in your pocket unless it goes through a retail establishment or a food service establishment first. And so I always, in my opinion, that high retail prices is where we want to be. Now, if we have trouble selling the volume of product we're producing, then certainly we need to drop the price so we clear the market. But that has not been the case. And so strong retail prices are a sign of strong demand. In this case, we've benefited from very high beef prices relative to pork prices, and that's going to go away over the next year or two, we think. We think beef production, it's up almost 10% from 2 years ago already in 2018, we think. And so if we go into the next year with another 3 or 4% increase in beef production, we're going to put some pressure on beef prices and take a bit of our pricing advantage away there. We're always at a disadvantage relative to chicken, and that disadvantage seems to just grow, so we're going to have to live with that. But proving our worth and having a high-value product in the eyes of consumer is a positive, always, always a positive. If we put those together to real per capita expenditures, you can see we're on a very strong uptrend for the 3 major species. We omit turkey in this because the turkey price from retail, from USDA is not a very good one. It's a whole bird price. Had a terrific 14 and 15, a little bit down in 16. We had a tough first quarter of 2017, and then it's been pretty good since then. We're going to get back close to 1% down from a year ago. If we look at the individual species, here's pork. We dug ourselves a huge hole in January and February. We had a really good late summer, and we've gained so that we're down only 1% through November. We're not going to catch up to last year's total for real per capita expenditures for the year with December, but we think that that's going to stay strong enough that we end up within 1%. I think that's a terrific performance given how high demand has been in recent years. Beef, not quite as good, but they've had a very good second half of the year. And chicken has just had kind of an average year all year for real per capita expenditures. I think they're going to see more of that in the future. The other side of demand, of course, is exports, and this has been a great story in 2017. If there's one reason that I would cite for the financial success that you've had last year, it's this. Exports are significantly better than we expected them to be at the beginning of the year. We had 4% growth on it. It's going to end up close to 8%. Millie Haley and the Economic Research Service had 6%, and to be real honest, some people kind of laughed at that at the beginning of the year. I know some very knowledgeable people that only had 1 or 2% growth rate. So we've had really great growth of exports. We had a record month in November. The weekly data would say December was about as good as last year, so we think that's going to be a very strong close when we get the December data. It's been a very good year. We're kind of back on this growth curve of where we were from 2004 to 2012, trending back higher, positive, and one of the reasons for that is a weaker dollar. I apologize for the kind of hard to see line. I haven't figured out how to do that on the new graph program yet. But the point to make is when we went into 2017, we had a dollar that is about as strong as anybody could remember. And the fiscal policy ideas of the Trump administration, a stimulus package, a tax cut, all those things, and the almost certainty that the Fed was going to be raising interest rates, both pointed to a stronger dollar. And, I think just about anybody that was watching this was betting that the dollar would strengthen back on January 1. And of course, during the year, the dollar lost about 10% of its value. It rallied a little bit late in the year, but in recent weeks, it's broken some key support levels that would suggest it may go down here into the mid-80s on the dollar index measure. And so the weaker dollar was awfully good for our exports. And right now, if I had to bet on anything, I would say the dollar would weaken from this point, which would say it's going to be good for exports in 2018. Individual currencies of our major customers, pretty steady with the exception of the peso. Late last year, we had this huge surge exports to Mexico in November and December. And it was done on a peso that was much weaker than it had been the year prior, and here's the key, and was losing value every week. Okay? So if you're a Mexican buyer of hams, and our prices are relatively low, like they were in the fall of 16, and the currency that you're holding is going to be less valuable next week than it is this week, what are you going to do? Buy now. And that's what they did. And we had very, very good shipments to Mexico in November and December. Since then, the peso's gained about 10%. It's rocked around, lost a little bit this summer, primarily on some uncertainty about NAFTA. Imagine that. And but still, it's 10% more valuable than it was a year ago. That puts them in a better buying position for our products, and they have certainly stood in and bought those. This is John Johnson's favorite chart. So it is busy, I admit that, but you got to get the information up here. And I want to point out a few things. Number one is Japan rocks along here, a pretty steady eddy for our exports. They are our number one value market because they put a floor price basically under the products we can sell there, so we can only sell high value products. The number one market for muscle cuts and for pork variety meats from the United States is Mexico. And I would argue that you can put a little bit of an uptrend line right here in this other market line in recent years, but that's really the only true growth market we've had for exports. So this is why when you talk to the folks at MPPC, they are about all trade all the time right at the moment. I mean, this is critical for our business. Now, should the NAFTA go away, does that mean this thing's going to drop to zero? No, it doesn't. I mean, we have a locational advantage against Brazil or the EU or anybody else in exporting product to Mexico. So it's not as if it goes to zero. But if they put a tariff on, that tariff will be taken out of the price of the product that goes down there. So the value will go down. And we will lose some volume, no question. I don't think we're going to zero, and I don't think it's probably going to even happen this year, even if they walked away this week, which I'm still, people say, what's going to happen on trade? Well, this president has said some pretty silly things, but I don't think he's a stupid man at all. And he also is a negotiator. And I still am hanging my hat on him staking out an extreme position from which he can negotiate a good deal for us. I hope that's right, and it makes sense, but that's about as far as I can go on expectations. I mean, if anybody else knows more than that, I'd sure like to hear it. All right? I don't think we have any assurances of this yet, but I have to believe that we see the good that this thing does for a lot of America and try to get it improved for those that it doesn't help. It's a 25-year-old deal. It probably needs some rehashing. I'd be the first to tell you that. But I can't believe we're going to walk away from it. That's my 2 cents worth. We'll see about December whether I was right or not. But the point is, Mexico is a growth market. Korea's been pretty good this year, and that's an encouragement. China is our next great market that might always be our next great market. And it kind of bounces around, and they're very opportunistic about when they buy. They're down significantly this year. November was good because November a year ago was really bad. Okay, so those year-over-year comparisons, you have to be careful of them. I think the important thing to take away from this is Mexico is our only clear growth market. It needs to remain that. All right, let's talk about feed real quickly. I think I can summarize this pretty quickly. There's a bunch of stuff out there. It's not going to be very expensive. All right? So if you, okay, we'll skip about 6 slides now. But 2.477 billion projected carryout. I mean, that's 17% of usage. You put it on the stocks to use versus price chart, and it's way out on the right tail at very low corn prices. We don't see any end to that, at least for this crop year. If we look at what's going on with grain-consuming animal units and corn usage, you know, the ethanol program taught us how to feed animals with something other than corn. And we still have learned that, and we're going to do it for a while. Now, we're not going to get too far away from this corn feed usage line, but the point is, you know, you don't have to have all that corn out there. We know how to feed animals without it. If we look at exports, they're trailing the year-ago pace dramatically. We think that that's going to continue, even with a weaker dollar. We think that's probably going to continue. And so if you look at nearby futures, historically, you can see we've been in this $3.50 to $4 trading range for the better part of 2.5 years. I think we're probably going to stay there for the foreseeable future. We don't see anything in this market, especially as we look at weather in South America right now, which the press and the trade keeps trying to kill that crop down there, and there isn't any reason to be killing it from what we can tell. Okay, if we look at beans, 470 million bushel carry out, 11% of stocks, not quite as extreme as the corn one on the stocks to use to price ratio, but still quite a ways out there. Only 2007 and 2016 had higher stocks to use ratios, puts beans at about 950. We think there's going to be a lot of soybean meal at $300 to $335, $40 a ton. Now, there's been a nice little rally on soybeans meal the last couple of weeks. Lots of it based on what's going on in South America and whether they can buy beans and whether they have meal to sell. We still think our pace of exports is trailing last year. I heard an analyst say 2 weeks ago that it's very possible that we will not export 2 billion bushels of beans. So instead of 2.16 as USDA has, that would be only 2 billion. And at the pace we're going right now, that's in the realm of possibility. So with that kind of softness in exports, we think we're going to have a lot of bean meal here in the low 300s. I wouldn't get too worried about this recent rally. So we think you're going to have costs somewhere in the low 60s. This is the Iowa State University parameters, 62, 64 as of yesterday, I think is the day before yesterday. Last week that number was 61 and change. It went up just a little bit because of this little bit of a grain rally. This would be the best 10 or 15% of producers. But think about, if you've looked at lean hog futures prices the last few days, there's not one on the board that has a lower number than that. So there's no losses to speak of at all, and we'll show you that here in a bit. So we're in great shape on costs. Competition. Growth in chicken, about 2% this year. That's pretty modest for chicken. We don't think that they're going to grow very much more. This comes from our friends at EMI. If we look at the forecast on breast meat prices, lower relative to a year ago, so that means some more competition for pork products at the retail level. The other thing that's behind this is that the breast meat is not having to carry as much value. Wing prices have gone up and have stabilized. They used to be very, very seasonal, up until the Super Bowl and then off the face of the earth. They don't do that anymore. There was about 300 wing concept restaurants open last year in the United States. The number won't be quite that large this year, but it's going to be close. And as I tell people, the last time we checked, those birds only still have 2 wings. And so it puts some supply pressure. In addition, they've added some value to leg quarters with boneless thigh meat at a lot of retail establishments now, and that's a pretty good product. And we think that they're going to carry some more value too. On the beef side, David Weber at EMI provides his forecast for slaughter. Here's total cattle. They were up 5.2% last year, another 4% this year. Steer and heifer slaughter, a little more growth than that, 4.7%. And if we put in heavier cattle, which we think that they had weights that were mitigated early last year, but certainly grew as the year went on. 5.6% increase in beef production in 2018. So while we're going to grow production, it's not anywhere near as big as what the beef sector is looking at. And we have to remember that the last part of that cow herd growth in 13 and 14 coming off the droughts, those kind of the last big bunch of those heifers that went in, we're just getting their first calf this year in the slaughter mix. So there's more to come. We will get a beef inventory report next week. We think it's going to tell us that we stopped keeping heifers at nearly the kind of pace we have the last couple of years. But the beef industry is an aircraft carrier that does not turn corners very quickly. And so you're probably going to see 4+% increase in 2019 and maybe that big in 2020. We don't see this thing slowing down much until 2021 or 2. All right, hogs and pork. World production will grow this year by about 1.8% according to the Foreign Ag Service. That's after 4 years of basically no growth. Most of that growth is in China and the United States. There are some smaller countries that are still growing as well. We look for production in the European Union to go down. Their prices have been falling, and so we think we're going to have some mitigation there. If we look at the December hogs and pigs report, an interesting one mainly because of the timing of its release. USDA has started to release that before Christmas. They do it while the markets are open instead of while the markets are closed, and so it's kind of always interesting to see what happens there. But this report came out, and the first thing we noticed was that the actual percentages of 1 year ago were almost exactly the same as the analyst estimates before the report. So that should be pretty neutral. If anything, it might have been a little bearish because these lightweight inventories were a little bit larger. The second thing we noticed was, that the USDA had actually revised the breeding herd for the last 4 quarters. That's the first time that I can remember in my professional career that USDA has revised their breeding herd estimate. They may have done it back there a few times, way back there, but it has been a long time. And so it's kind of an important thing, and I'll show you why, because it changes the growth rate that we've been observing. And I'll show you that in a moment. The third thing was that the numbers for farrowing intentions were way larger than what analysts had expected. Now, that wasn't a big surprise to me. And the reason it wasn't was USDA has spent about 3 years underestimating farrowing intentions. The actual farrowings in 11 of those 12 quarters were larger than either of the intentions numbers that had been previously published. So they were missing low all the time. You always wonder what analysts are estimating before these reports. Are they estimating what they think USDA is going to say? Okay. Or are they estimating the right number? Okay. Is it what you think it's going to be or you think they're going to say? And I think almost always analysts are trying to predict what USDA is going to say. And they did that here based on this last 3 years of undershots, and USDA kind of recalibrated things, and so we got a big miss. We think that these farrowing intention numbers are pretty accurate the way they've been published. We've used them in all of our forecasts. I think it's a major kind of, as they say, somewhat of a recalibration by the folks at NASS. They did this on the pig inventories a year ago. In December of 16, the pig inventories were way larger than what the analysts had expected because USDA had spent 3 years underestimating them, and they kind of recalibrated, and they've been pretty close over the last year. So I kudos to them for doing this. We think it's a positive. Litter size up 1.1%. That's just more of the same. Okay, so let's talk about the breeding herd. The breeding herd had been growing steadily really since 2009. Not many blips in this thing, an average rate of about 0.7%. And the original USDA numbers for the last 4 quarters would say that that continued. But when they did their revisions, now it says about 1.2%. And that actually fits with what I think we see in the anecdotal evidence of sow units being added and those kind of things. So this is, we're going to forecast the breeding herd up 1.2% and farrowings to be commensurate with that with the new USDA relationships. Second, pig per litter just keeps going up. We had record large pig per litter in the September-November quarter. When we get the February quarter, it's going to be record large as well. A little seasonal downtick, and then 3 records the rest of the year. There could be some complication of that. Obviously, we had some complication of the PEDV back here. But this is a pretty predictable kind of growth on litter size. And so what does that mean for the market herd? It means higher market herd. I mean, the December herd was 65 and change. It was record large for December compared to a year ago. And if we look at this chart, it tells us a few things. Number one is there's still a significant amount of seasonal variation here. You can see all this little variation within 1 year. It's seasonal. It's not nearly as big as it was back prior to the mid-90s when we had a lot of outdoor farrowing, and we would have 10 or 15, 20% range between the high and the low for seasonal. But there's still seasonal variation. Moving the sows indoor, we haven't completely fooled Mother Nature at all on that one. The second one is there is no hog cycle. Prior to 2000, one of the most established cycles in all of economics was the hog cycle. 4 years top to top, bottom to bottom, prices moved in the opposite direction. If you look at the production side at least, there's no hog cycle there past the ending of this cycle that peaked in 1998 and went down into 2000, and then it's been pretty steady. The only variations away from the trends are 2 animal health situations. The first was a positive animal health situation called circovirus vaccines that allowed millions of pigs to live that would have died. Okay? All I can say is thank God the Chinese were there to buy that pork in 2008, or we would have been in a world of hurt. What did we do in response to that? We reduced the sow herd by 500,000 head in 2 years because we didn't need that many sows anymore. Now, you had a little complication here because of higher feed costs, yes, but I would say that the most important reason we reduced that sow herd was the fact that we had circovirus vaccines and we had pigs living that used to not live to see market weight. The second one, of course, was PEDV. So what's my conclusion from this? Now, we can get a lot of variation of these trends, but on 20 years worth of data, going on 20 years worth of data, it looks like the major ones are animal health incidents. And so I think we need to pay attention to that and think about it, and there are a lot of people doing that. Let me make one point, and this is an old chart. I'll give you the new data here in a moment. November, that day, the same day that the Hogs and Pigs report came out, so did the cold storage report. And this is the reason that the market rallied coming out of that report day and into the next week, and is one of the reasons it's continued to rally, is we had a pull down of frozen pork stocks twice as large as is normal for November, even though we had record high production. We moved a slug of pork that month, and that was the bullish driver of that report of the market that day. All right, so when we did crunch the numbers, our forecast for slaughter this year up 3.5% for the year, with the bulk of that being in the second half. 4% growth plus, almost 5% in the fourth quarter on a year-over-year basis. I show the forecast of the Livestock Marketing Information Center and of Dr. Lee Schultz at Iowa State. Here, just as comparison and context, I think that's valuable. Lee and I are pretty close together. Jim Robb and his staff, quite a bit smaller than we are, but 126 million or so hogs in 2018. Notice back here in the PEDV year, 106 million. So a 20% increase in slaughter based on that was an admittedly reduced slaughter that year, but still so many more hogs available. And if we look at it on a weekly basis, the red smooth line would be our forecast for this year. And notice that with the 2 new plants in at single shift only, we get back kind of slaughter capacity here in the fourth quarter of this year. Not severely and not for many weeks, so I don't think there's a lot of negative impact on hog prices, but it could be. And plus, if we get a second shift going at Sioux City, that'll certainly help. And the last we heard is the Prestige folks are still planning on slaughtering some hogs in early November of next year, and so that would help a bit, even though that'll be a slow ramp up. Notice what our projection for the next year is, though. These are big numbers in 2019, and you know, part of that die is already cast. I mean, we're getting close to having pigs. You're only a few months away from having pigs farrowed that'll be killed in 19. And we certainly think that that's a reasonable kind of growth rate. And if we do that, based on now, current capacity, we're going to be tight again. Of course, we'll have the Prestige plant up full by then, at least on one shift, and maybe have, I think we'll have a double shift at Sioux City by that time, but still a lot of growth. Last week's number was below our forecast, mainly because of disruptions at Seaboard's plant in Oklahoma and in North Carolina. Probably left about 30,000 head or so that we're going to have to slaughter this week. And of course, we've had our own weather challenges this week that's going to be pushed mainly to Saturday slaughter. What's going on with diseases? That's probably been the biggest question. And we don't have a lot of hard and fast data on this. I think the best data we get is from University of Minnesota every week. They have a sample of sow farms that they measure for PRRS and for PEDV. This is the PRRS one. This is this year's number, cumulative number relative to history, and you can see we're worse than a few years recently, but certainly not nearly as bad as we were in the more distant past. I don't think there's enough variation here to suggest that we're creating some marketing hole for the summer because of PRRS losses. If we look at PEDV, that conclusion is even more solid, in my opinion, as we're just about where we are. Only the epidemic year of 2014 was much worse, and these samples are big. There's 2.4 million sows in the sample on the PRRS data and 3 million sows in the PEDV sample. And it's not a random sample or anything like that, but it's a big one. When you're measuring that much of the U.S. sow herd, you have to think, you know, there's not a lot of room for slippage here. If we look at weights, and this one, this is an older chart by decision. Weights, we're close to the year before most of the year. We started backing hogs up a little bit in September. We did it kind of big time in October when some of the packer margins got tight, and packers cut some Saturday kills, and they pushed some hogs back a bit, and they got heavier. Now, I think the thing to learn here is last year, of course, in 16, we didn't increase weights in the fall. We did in this fall, but it was, until we got into late November, it was pretty much a normal kind of seasonal impact. And we'll show you in just a minute, we think weights are going to be a bit larger this year, not significantly so, but a bit more on low feed costs and some kind of backed up, pent up ability to increase weights. Here's our price forecast. And, if you look at our price forecast in the futures, most of you would have a good chuckle out of that probably and say, well, that's not very close. And it isn't. But our price forecasts are based on some fundamental supply and demand models. If you had mid-70s prices last summer, you should have slightly lower prices than that this summer because the supplies are going up. And if demand is steady. So why are the futures this high? That's a good question. It certainly appears to us that the traders in these futures contracts are doing one of two things. They're either factoring in much higher demand, or they think that pig supplies aren't going to be nearly as large as what was suggested by the December Hogs and Pigs report. One of the two. Or perhaps they're just on the long side of the market and they drive it up. whatever it is, it spells an opportunity for hog producers. You have the chance to price these hogs on the futures market right now at prices significantly higher than I can come up with on a fundamental analysis of the hog and pork market. Okay? We think you ought to take a very serious look at that. There's ways to do this that doesn't put a lot of margin money at risk. Your brokers can talk to you about that, and we'd sure encourage you to do that. Now, could hogs be $90? Well, that's a possibility. There's no set deal here. There's a distribution, and that's always a possibility. So that's one of the reasons you might want to think about using option strategies to do this, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute, what the probabilities are. Of course, slaughter capacity, we've had a lot of talk about that. Big increase in September. The plants have ramped up at reasonably good speed. Had some challenges at the Triumph Seaboard plant in Sioux City. They've gone a little slower than what they had anticipated. At one time they said they'd be full by November, and they certainly aren't there yet. So they've had some challenges. The Clemens plant in Michigan up at 8350 a day. Windham, Minnesota is running about 5100. We had a bit of a setback with the Moon Ridge plant in Missouri. They did not operate last week. They did not operate this week. We don't know what's going to happen for sure. We have heard that they're putting in a major piece of equipment, and if they're doing that, that gives us some optimism. My historical in my professional life, when one of these plants is suspended operations, it's very hard for them to start back up. I hope that's not the case here. I'm just telling you the facts as we know them out there, and we hope that they will be back up very soon and operating. Small plant, but those can be very important. So that's kind of where we stand there. The other one, of course, we mentioned the Prestige plant under construction, got a roof on the building, been working all winter. They hope to kill hogs in November. All right, pork production. Add a little bit of weight, and here's where we are for pork production. We were high on our forecast last fall. Actual production came in a bit lower than that, but we expect 2 to 3% growth in the first half of the year, 4 to 5% growth in the second half of the year of production. Part of that is weights. And we started the year at about 1.5 pounds heavier than a year ago. I think we're going to see a lot of that. Okay? We spent a couple of years not increasing weights very much at all in the United States. The primary reason for that, in my opinion, is we had farms that were using quite a bit of Paline before then, and they started phasing that out. We're not using nearly as much of it. It's not zero by any stretch, but still, that means that the hogs grow slower, and if you don't have enough barn space, you've got to reduce end weights. We've caught up some with that space issue, and so I think we're going to push these weights 1.5 pounds or so higher this year. We could see another 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds in 2019, we think, all depending on feed costs, but certainly feed cost is not standing in the way of weight growth this year. All right, this is a hot off the press chart. I sat down on the trade floor and downloaded the cold storage data that was released this afternoon, and you can see that total cold storage for pork went down during the month of December. It normally goes down in December, and the drawdown was very close to normal. We're just a little bit higher than we were a year ago on cold storage. I think this total cold storage number is neutral to the market. It really doesn't say anything big that anything one way or the other is happening. Now, the number within that that's important is what's going on with bellies. A year ago, we were pulling these stocks down, and we went into the year at very low stock range, the record lows for January and February. Right now, we're at 2x where we were at the end of December. And we're going into the year well up here into this range. Normally, you're going to build stocks in January as you come off of the holidays, still with pretty large slaughter levels. We think that prices have been such that there's been bellies put into the freezer as we've gone through January. So we think that we're building stocks, and we have a lot more pad there going into the 2018 belly market than we did last year. Well, what happened last year? I'm going to skip that one and come back to it. Of course, we went on this wild roller coaster. We had the huge run-up in January. Users backed off of that. We went down to $1 and change here in late April, and then the thing exploded as supplies got tighter going into the summer because we weren't producing as many bellies, and we certainly didn't have the stocks going into it. That's going to be fundamentally different from what we can see right now. Now, a lot of things can change between now and May on bellies. And let me tell you, I mean, I've been trying to forecast belly prices the last 2 or 3 years, and On average, I might have got it, but boy, the variation has really killed us. But we don't think you're going to see $2 plus bellies this summer. That's the reason our forecast, is here $1.40, $50, somewhere in that range. That difference of $70 or so on 18% of the carcass would be about $11, $12 on the cutout value, and that would pretty much be taken right off the hog price. So therein lies the reason that our summer forecast for hogs are significantly lower than they were, than what we've seen and what some people expect. And that's one of the reasons we kind of doubt that we're going to see a lot higher than where the futures markets are right now. If we look at the others, this is drawdown during the month. How much did we change from the prior month? Of course, we increased total pork a bit. It's kind of a normal kind of a number. That's the 5-year average is about minus 10,000 pounds. We did minus 4.9. If we took two frozen hams, kind of a normal kind of drawdown here, a little less than normal than what we would see. The normal would be minus 40. It came in about minus 20. And on bellies, our normal situation is to build those stocks by about 12 million pounds. We only built them by about 3 million pounds during December. So it wasn't a huge buildup of bellies, but it's way ahead of where we were 1 year ago. Our cutout value forecast somewhere up in the near $90 for the summer, back down in the mid to low 70s for the fall. Notice the projections based on those supplies for next year are pretty tight and really tough once we get to the fourth quarter, because we would have very large production levels and we could see that cutout value well down in below $70. What's the future say? Well, this starts back in September of last year. It bottomed out in October. And then as we go through this last year, I don't have every month on here. You can see where we went off the board with the July contract at just over 90. And here's where we were earlier this week on all the contracts that were on the board, an average of about 75.80 for all of the contracts that were on the board this year. 75.80, $62 and change on cost. Take a 200-pound carcass, 210-pound carcass, and your profits are somewhere about $26, $27 per head on average if you have costs that match these forecasts that we have here based on the Iowa State parameters. Now, like I said, that's probably the best 10 or 15% of producers. Some of you might be higher than that, but even if you're $4 higher than that, you've still got profits of somewhere in the $18 a head range for 2018 offered to you right now by the futures market with corn, soybean meal, and hogs on these historical relationships. Okay. So, we're pretty optimistic about this year. I mean, we think cash markets are going to be good. We think you're being offered even better than that right now to lock in some profits. You don't have to do them all, and we think you ought to think about that. Risks, the number one risk for our business anytime is something that stops our exports. And at the top of that list would be a major disease, export impacting disease. Foot and mouth disease, African swine fever, classical swine fever. Many of you heard about the NPPC and their involvement with the Farm Bill and their proposal to get a foot and mouth disease vaccine bank funded so that we have a bank of vaccine ready to treat this disease. It's really important because it goes beyond us. I mean, foot and mouth disease affects cattle, affects sheep, affects goats. And so if we have a break in any of those, the export markets will be closed until we can get that thing localized and regionalized in some fashion. And that's what the foot and mouth vaccine bank would do. So that's an important one. It addresses our number one risk. It's the largest, it's by far the largest impact, pretty low probability, and a foot and mouth disease, an effective bank of vaccine would reduce the longevity of that problem and help us reduce the total impact. Number two, trade issues. Nobody's heard about any of this, right? Obviously, the president and his positions on trade. We have Japan and the European Union did a free trade deal that goes into effect 1 year from now on January 1st, 2019. It's basically the same thing that we negotiated under Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the EU is in the position with that. The other 11 countries of the TPP, by the way, signed that agreement yesterday. And so it's moving forward without the United States, and that includes Canada. And so Canada will have some advantages there as well, and the EU with this will come from January next year. Now, this underscores the philosophy and the practice, hopefully the practice, of this administration on doing deals. They said, well, we don't like those big multilateral deals, and I understand that. So we're going to go do bilateral deals, and I'm saying get after it, because we haven't heard any results yet. So we like the idea, but you got to get them done. They've been a little busy with NAFTA and the Korean Free Trade Agreement, and so until we get that done, maybe there's not going to be much progress. But this is important to get started on these, because the clock is ticking with us and Canada and the EU. Steve, does the TPP start January 1 of 19? When does it? Is that when it starts? What? Beginning of 19, the one that they signed yesterday. So yeah, so Canada would enjoy that same advantage come January 1 of next year. Labor, obviously an issue in the plants. The plants have said since kind of the beginning that they had plenty of labor for their first shift. I haven't heard many comments about the second shift at Sioux City, and I'm concerned about that. We've always had some challenges with labor on farms. What's going to happen with immigration policy? We know there was a knockdown drag out over part of that just this last week. The other point I would make is this electronic data logging thing that has affected trucks. In effect, the place where it really has its impact is it reduces the supply of truck driver labor by a certain percentage by requiring and readily enforcing rest times. It's not that they weren't always required. It's EDL kind of makes that more enforceable. So that's where it's having the effect there. Now, we've had a waiver on the livestock side to these EDL requirements that we're trying to get an extension on at the present time, but there's no waiver on the other side of the plant. And we've been hearing lots of talk from packers about having trouble getting trucks on the other side. Neil Dirks said a packer told him a couple weeks ago they paid $10,000 kind of premium for a truck to take a hot load to a load that had to get to the West Coast a couple weeks ago. That's 25 cents a pound. All right, that's a chunk, and it's because we effectively reduced the supply of truck driver labor. Diseases, we talked about those a while ago. Lots of talk. The data say we're kind of normal. For those of you who have disease outbreaks, I understand it's bad. The problem is there's somebody that had a disease outbreak last year that isn't having one this year. And when we weigh those out, we usually can't see them in the supply data. Feed costs, 2 crop failures to match the old price of the big high cost of 12 and 13. We think with our carryout stocks we can get through a single crop failure. We'll have higher costs, up in the 70s probably. But not 80 some or close bumping $90 like we did coming out of the 2 droughts unless we have 2 in a row. Now, they don't have to both be in the United States. We had one in the United States, one South America, back to back. We'd see some pretty bad impacts of that. But the chances of getting 2 of those successively are pretty low. And I think that's a positive for us, but it's a risk we have to recognize. Demand, will we see growth this year? We're in good shape on consumer preferences. The fear of animal fats seems to be behind us. If we can keep Dr. Oz from screwing something up, we'll be okay. And of course, we're actively fighting those battles all the time, but that looks pretty good. The wage and income growth that we've seen, kind of the tip of it here this fall, I think that could really help us on the domestic side. And of course, we get on the export side, a weaker dollar would help. Trade issues, we've talked about Mexico. 2 things there. One is just dealing business with Mexico, but the other one is they're in the midst of a major expansion of their breeding herd there. And they're going to grow their domestic supply. The Smithfield's building a packing plant there. It's going to provide some lower value cuts for the Mexican market. They have a free trade agreement with Japan. So you think they might want to ship some loins and tenderloins over there and compete with us? I'd bet on it. And so that could that could be a negative for us. And finally, the bigger risk that I see longer term is if we fill all these plants up, including the Prestige plant sometime in 2019, and we fill a double shift at Sioux City, we're going to have a lot more pork products out there than what we've had in the past, and that's going to depress not just farm values, but the cutout value, which will also negatively impact hog prices going forward. Okay, I'm going to put the price forecast sheet back up there so any of you can look at it and jot it down if you want to while we take a question or two. Yeah, Brad.
The scenario you just outlined where we would fill all those plants based on current inventories, is that possible?
No, we have to build the sow herd some more. I think. No, I don't think so, Brad. I mean, 1.2% growth on the sow herd, add a fraction of growth on farrowings, and 1 to 1.5% growth on litter size, and put that over 2 years, and you come up with 6% more pigs. I think we can feed them. It won't take a lot to get enough hogs to feed them. Okay? It's not a way outlier anyway. What is the cause of the weak dollar? That's a $64 question right there. And I have not gotten a good answer, even from people that know what they're doing. Okay? It's really kind of a mystery. The EU is still not very good. I quote him all the time. A friend of mine, Bob Dealey, is a macroeconomist, runs a website called nospinforecast.com, and there's a couple things I'll mention from Bob. The other question I get a lot is, how long is this thing going to stay good on the stock market? You all have to remember that the stock market has predicted 12 of the last 3 recessions, okay? So I'm not sure it's a good use. But Bob has a model that predicts recessions with about a 9-month lead, and it's been uncannily accurate. And it says it's not there. The metric on his model is not near the critical level at this point. All right? That's one. The other one is I asked Bob that same question. I said, Bob, I don't understand why the dollar weakened like it did. We have to remember that index is 48% the euro. So whatever the euro does really shows up there. All right? And the euro has gained value. It kind of was on fire today, going up. I don't have a good explanation for why that is. And Bob says his only explanation is politics. Is a lot of Europeans don't like Trump, and so they started dumping dollars, kind of in spite of what might have been their best position. It's just a political, philosophical difference. And I said, Bob, that's not a very good explanation. And he said, I'm sorry, that's the best I got. So I do not have a good macro. I wasn't ever really good on macro, but I know enough about it to be dangerous, and I don't have a very good explanation for why that is. If anybody in the room wants to take a shot at that, it's all yours. Okay? Don't everybody jump at once. Yeah.
How does the CME figure their Lean Hog Index?
The Lean Hog Index is figured. It uses a weighted average of the negotiated hog price and the swine report market formula for the last 2 days of business. So it's a weighted average for this day, and then a weighted average, and then you compute the same thing for yesterday, and then you compute a weighted average of those two. And it's just the negotiated and the swine report market formula that goes into that. And the weighted average is computed as head times weight times price divided by head times weight. Okay? So that's what it is. There's a document on their website, I believe, that explains how it's done. And I can vouch. I've got a spreadsheet that figures it, and it comes up the same number as what they publish every day. So it's a function of what's going on the cash hog market. It's really driven by the negotiated hog market. Now, more and more, there's an influence of the cutout value in that swine report market formula category. Okay, but it's publicly available data. It comes from the 201. No. Is it 201? Yeah, 201. The prior day slaughter report. There was a question back here.
About a year ago, I did some calculations on the value of hog receipts in the state of Iowa from the 1970s, several years from the 1970s, and compared it to the more recent years. We had some high pork prices. And I found that the actual value of pork to farmers, when we had independent hog farmers, was more or equal to some of these years when we had very high prices. And I talked to a well-known regional economist who feels that we probably would have more value for livestock producers if we had less contracting and more independent producers.
Okay. Was there a question there? or just a statement?
Well, give me your response.
Well, I haven't seen the data or how you computed it, so if that's what the data told you, then that's what they did. I would guess there's some factors in there other than just having independent producers that would be involved. I can't believe that the cash receipts on Iowa hogs wouldn't be anywhere near now back then what they are now, given the growth of finishing in Iowa. Okay, we finish a lot more hogs here than we did in the past. So I have to take your word for it because I haven't done the numbers. I don't think contract growers or independent producers, I wouldn't think that that would be the driving force in that. I would think it'd be more the relationships between finishers and packers and the value of the pigs and the quality of the pigs. But you know, I'd like to see what you've done because I haven't done that work. Others? Yeah.
Curious what your thoughts are on the idea of we were adding plants, but some of the older plants we're seeing maybe shutting down as new plants competing for market share.
I run from that question really hard. But I will take a shot at it. No, I don't. And I've been asked that since those plants were announced 4 years ago. There's a couple of things. Number one is the plants that we have that are out there, even the old ones, have had significant investments to them. And I'll give you one example. You know, one of the plants that's always been on the, oh my gosh, we're going to lose this plant list is Louisville, the JBS plant. They just put in a CO2 stunning system in that plant. I mean, they put a slug of money in that. It would take a really severe situation for them to close it after putting that kind of money in it. And all of the others have seen that. So number one is it puts the company in a position where they wouldn't want to do it. And number two is it makes the plant a lot more competitive. All right? And I think all of them have been done that way. When I looked at the landscape here, and I think the key is the growth in numbers that you see up here. If we were raising the same number of hogs we did last year, there would be at least one and probably 2 or 3 plants that would be really susceptible here. But we're bringing hogs, enough hogs, to keep these plants running at reasonable kinds of throughput rates. The third factor is packer margins have been really good for 5-6 years. There's pretty deep pockets there right now, and if they can hold on and get to a position where, you know, kind of the 7/10 or 8/10 of growth in population and any kind of growth in exports can catch up with us, I think they're still going to be in good shape. So I've kind of said from the beginning that large single shift plants would probably be under some economic pressure, but I didn't see any of them closing. All right. Now, we probably got a few small plants that might be a little iffy because, you know, it doesn't take very many hogs out of their mix to really make hurt. An example is Greenwood Pack in South Carolina closed 1.5 years ago. Okay. Are there some more of those? Maybe. But it's been my position from the beginning that I didn't think we were going to lose a packing plant through this. And as long as supplies grow kind of as we anticipate, I still think that's the case. The question was, how do we explain the consistent growth in Mexico? Because in a nutshell, it's still poorer than the United States, but it's way better than it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And the incomes are growing there in the middle class, and they've increased the quality of their diet, and they like pork, okay? So I think that's really the question, is while it's still far below the United States on standard of living, it's way better than it was, okay? That's the big driver. As far as China, of course, we had growth in incomes in China, too. There's a lot of government policy that stands between the Chinese consumer and the international supplier of pork, especially. And there's tariffs. They're a very protected industry. They make decisions on a whim sometimes on things. We've become a pawn in the battle over canned chicken from China being brought to the United States and other things on occasion. And so I would say the biggest problem with China has been government policy to a great degree. But Mexico, yes, there's still a lot of poor people in Mexico, but they're in much better economic shape than they were. And that's one of the reasons we need the NAFTA. I mean, you know, I remember back in the 90s, you know, I can't remember who it was, but, you know, it basically said, the reason I'm for NAFTA is we don't need a third world country on our southern border. And they may not be up to, near our standard of living, but they're better off than they used to be.
One last question.
Yes, ma'am. The question was, are we going to see more value added in products that are more prepared in grocery stores? I could probably ask John, does the pork board have any research on that? I mean, I would think we would have some more value added, portion control, those kinds of things.
I don't know if we have any detailed research, but anecdotally, we're increasing the number of items available on others that really
Yeah, and of course, that's been a major thing over the last several years of marinated and all those kinds of products that we see a lot more of than we used to. I think the important thing is we've got to get some value added to some parts of the pig, the loin especially, that just have lagged the rest of the carcass. And so whatever needs to be done, we need to get done on that.
John, did you have a question? Okay. I had a question too. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Steve Myers. He is a contributor, one of our market columnists, along with his colleague, Joe Kerns, and we really appreciate the rotation that we have going on, so we hope you follow along with us at National Hog Farmer. And let's give Steve a round of applause for his time today.
Thank you.